Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, you're listening to another episode of Divergent Conversations podcast. I'm your co-host, Patrick Casale, joined today by Dr. Anna Neff and Thomas Henley, who is the host of the Thoughty Auti Podcast. So guest number one on our podcast, and Megan and I just released on Friday, and the response has been fantastic. Feedback's been fantastic. And we're both overwhelmed as hell. Is that right, Megan?
Yeah, that's right. We were talking before on air how we're both in scatterbrain today. So that'll make for a fun conversation or something.
Yep. And I definitely just steamrolled through the intro and didn't even let Megan introduce herself. So sorry.
I know. I was leaning into, but actually.
I know. I saw it. I saw it. I'm sorry for that. Thomas, we appreciate you being here and just making the time. We know you're 6 hours ahead of me and 9 hours ahead of Megan. So, and I think we're going to talk about alexithymia today. And I think we're also going to talk about whatever the hell is going on in our lives and making us feel so scattered. So thank you for being here.
Of course. I wasn't, I think you might have mentioned it, but I wasn't totally aware that I was your first guest on the podcast. So I'm honored, very much so.
No pressure whatsoever. Megan, alexithymia is a topic that is near and dear to your heart. You talk about it often on your Instagram account, Neurodivergent Insights, and you have tons of resources. So I would love for you to start us off with why it feels important, why we're talking about that today.
Yeah. Okay. Trying to pull thoughts together. Cohesion. Here we go. Yeah. So I think it's a really relevant topic to autistic and ADHDers, particularly just because we tend to be more impacted by it. So first, just to do my definition of terms and then go into it. It's actually not a diagnosis. Sometimes people will DM me about how do I get diagnosed with this? It's not a diagnosis. It's a personality trait. And it's fairly common. 1 in 10 people have it. And it's difficulty identifying and describing emotions. So 1 in 10 people in the general population have it. Among autistic people, it's about 50% or higher. And then among ADHDers, the studies, there's so much variance, but I've seen between 20 to 45%. And then even those who don't have full threshold, they have more alexithymic traits. And this really makes things like emotion regulation, connecting with other people on kind of that deep emotional level, a lot more difficult. The other interesting thing about alexithymia is that a lot of things that have been attributed to autism, like difficulty with emotion recognition on faces or voice, empathy, which autism and empathy is a whole topic. It's huge. All these things, they've done studies, and when they pull out autistic people with alexithymia and autistic people without alexithymia, autistic people without alexithymia are doing as well as the control group. So a lot of the things that we've said that's an autistic thing is actually, that's a severe alexithymia thing. So that to me, when I read that, I was like, this explains why so many people aren't getting diagnosed, for one. For two, when a person is autistic with alexithymia, there's some higher support needs around emotional regulation, emotion identification. I actually have alexithymia. Because of my training, I would say I now have pretty mild alexithymia, and I've figured out how to adapt to it. But I definitely see how difficulty identifying emotions through my life has led to some hard stuff. So yeah, that's the clinical definition. Thomas, I'm curious to hear you. You're really interested in this topic. Where did that curiosity come from?
I think it's because I have quite a bit of a history with emotions. Ever since I was very young, I was pretty much fascinated by neurotypicals. I was kind of doing like the reverse autism specialist thing. I had a fascination with neurotypical people. And I remember from sort of early days, sort of at school, I would look at people around me, people, particularly during like high school, secondary school age, and they would be doing things with no reason or rhyme to why they're doing it, but they just seem to have something in their brain that like flicked a switch and then they went and did something. I now know that, for example, things like dancing, it's not a social display that you're like, I'm going to do a social display. It's a thing that you do because it feels good and people feel driven to do things that feel good. And I found that really confusing because I used to analyze a lot of the reasons behind a lot of my decision making. And I think it's, I was reading a book recently, I can't remember the reference, but they were talking about how emotions can be quite a big feed into how we make decisions. So it could be something as simple as food. You eat something and then you like, you pick in between like a cupcake and like some protein pancakes, and you model eating both of those in your brain, detects how you feel from eating those in that model, and then kind of use your emotions to probably get to the cupcakes. So I think there's a lot of depth to it, and a lot of the issues that I had, particularly in secondary school, was emotional dysregulation, a lot of mental health difficulties, but also not really as much of an ability to notice when my anxiety or my depression was getting worse. And, psychologists, therapists, they give me these anxiety worksheets. But the issue was with that is that you first got to know that you're anxious.
Exactly. Yeah. I talk about that when I do trainings on this, of like, we go from like 1 or 2 to 10, or at least that's our experience. We're not actually doing that, but we're not picking up, that like emotion thermometer, that stress thermometer. We're not picking up the subtle increase. And so that's what leads to those big emotion outbursts. They can also look very borderline or bipolar, which is another reason I think we get misdiagnosed, because it's so hard to regulate your emotions if you're not registering you're angry or stressed or anxious till it's at a 10.
Yeah, I think, and then society's kind of perceiving you and not how you're intending to react to things as well. And that inability to regulate is so challenging in social situations, but it's challenging in a lot of environments, like in the workplace, for example. Like if you're unable to identify your emotions, that can lead to a lot of workplace conflict as well. And I think that's why another reason that we see so many neurodiverse people struggling with neurotypical jobs and environments is just they're not set up to be successful in a lot of ways, and they're not set up to be affirmative.
It's quite key for like enforcing boundaries and stuff, like because a lot of people, they kind of someone says something that makes them upset or angry, they'd kind of get a bit of an emotional jolt to kind of be like, hey, actually that's not okay. Whereas in a lot of cases in my life, and from talking to other people, it seems that we just kind of take it and then we go away and think about it and come back like a week later, a couple of days later, like, actually, hey, this isn't good. And I think it can sometimes lead a lot of neurotypicals to not really trust like our reactions to things in the present. Yeah,
that is so well said. It can cause so much relationship confusion because the person with alexithymia, whether you're ADHD, autistic, or neurotypical, like we need that space to process. I think so reflective emotions is when we're bringing in our prefrontal cortex. I think a lot of us overcompensate for the fact that we're not feeling those more in the moment fleeting emotions by becoming really good at reflective emotions. But that takes time and space. And often we can't do that in an emotionally charged space. So like if we're having for example, emotionally charged conversation with our partner, we're going to have a really hard time accessing our emotions in that moment until we take some space. And especially if our partner is more anxiously attached, that space is going to feel like abandonment. And this is where I see a lot of relationships kind of go off the rails, is that dance that kicks up around that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, you and I are both in the mental health profession. So I think there's advanced training that goes on behind the scenes, right? Where we're like, okay, now we're starting to identify these emotions. Now I'm starting to become more familiar with how I'm feeling and experiencing how I'm moving through the world. Not everyone has that luxury and privilege and ability to do. So I think it becomes very murky, very confusing. And that's where you start to see a lot of dissociation and disconnection, and that really frustration, isolation, loneliness paradox that kicks in social environments. And I think that is so fucking hard for people when it feels so painful to identify what is really happening beneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of the best ways that I've found it to describe what it's like to be alexithymic to neurotypicals is like a threshold related condition. Like most people, if you take if we put a quantitative number on anxiety levels from 0 to 100, perhaps a lot of neurotypicals, they'd be able to tell within the 20 to 50% range that they are a certain level of anxiety. Whereas when you're autistic and you have alexithymia, that might be 70, 80, 90%. And a lot of those strategies that we learn to calm ourselves down, I found the most use in preventative things and blanket approaches to solving it when I was younger and I didn't really understand it. And it also led to, as you were saying about sort of disassociation, I actually did a lot of reading about it, and it was something that I noticed even when I was very young. And so I looked into that kind of thing, and I was like, hey, I have situations in my life where for some reason, in 10, 15 minutes, I feel like a completely different person. I feel differently in my body. I perceive the world differently. I behave differently. I must be a different person. And so I looked into dissociative identity disorder, and I was like, hey, this is actually what's happening, because I couldn't feel the emotion, and I had to go through and just look at all the science and the terminology and the philosophy behind different emotions, and really try and embed that in order to understand it in the future. But I used to have different colors, which obviously the colors were related to emotions, but at that time it just didn't click for me at all.
I think that captures something really important. Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know what is dissociation, what is alexithymia here, but one thing I notice among autistic people in general is a much more fragmented view of self. And so when you describe that of looking into DID, that's actually, I feel like probably pretty common for a lot of autistic people to look into DID, or I'm seeing a lot more about pleural systems now. Because it can be such a fragmented experience. And then we can't access our emotions even more so.
Megan, I'm curious about just in your own life, when you're experiencing alexithymia and kind of the identification, you're mentioning being fragmented, right? You and I have talked about fragmentation a lot, and just feeling so there's so many pieces here, and you can't always identify or connect them, and how that really is, showing up these days for you. In terms of you build an audience, you build a presence, you obviously have such a wonderful reputation. And I know you and I talk off the air about when you're feeling really heady, or when you're really in that space of teaching and researching, it can be disconnecting from how you're experiencing day to day too.
I actually think I feel the most connected when I'm in my head. And that's part of the problem, is it's so hard to be in my body, which I've talked about plenty. So when I'm in research flow or writing, I feel like the most like myself. It's all the other places I occupy that I'm And that's
Yeah.
right. Like that's actually a really common experience with special interests. We often feel most like ourselves when we're immersed in our special interest.
Absolutely.
And can access emotions. Like I see that with my clients when I start talking about special interests. There's an animation that pops up. Like we access emotions more easily. Thomas, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I just find it interesting you're talking about like feeling fragmented, because before I came across the concept of Alexithymia, I did a video and I did like a post on called like My Split Brain, and I was basically talking. I found this book called I think The Monkey Mind.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah, and I really.
Or go ahead and explain it though, because I know what you're talking about, but our listeners won't.
Yeah, it's like basically splitting your brain into the sort of the higher cognitive kind of prefrontal cortex, you as a you that uses intellectual things and logic and facts and things to dissect and understand your environment, whereas the monkey mind is the emotional brain, like things related to like the amygdala and drives and desires and needs that are important to survival. And the whole book is kind of about framing it as that you do have kind of these two pulling forces. One is like your willpower and your, I guess, more human side, and the other side is like the emotional kind of monkey side. But I found that really interesting, and I felt like it was probably one of the first things that I related to in terms of thinking about my emotions, because I did feel for a long time that I just couldn't, like facts and dates and events just seemed to be like ridiculously hard to connect them in my brain. Even if they are apparently clear, they don't feel like the feelings that I have from that event don't feel like they connect with that. And so I'll go a lot of situations where I've perhaps had a really bad experience during the day, and then for some reason I'll just be like, oh, I feel a bit anxious and I feel a bit down now. Why has that happened? And obviously I know that something bad's happened in the day, but it just doesn't immediately link. It's like I have to connect neural pathways together.
Yeah, it's not an automatic process. It's like, okay, I've got to analyze. Yeah. One thing when I started therapy like 5 years ago, one of the things my therapist said to me was like, you are so like analytical or like aware, but almost it wasn't a criticism, but it was a curiosity of like, and it was an interesting moment for me of like, isn't everyone doing this all day long? Just like analyzing the shit out of their day, trying to figure out why am I feeling this way? Like, and that was a really interesting moment for me because I could tell he was struck by like how analytical I was about my experience.
It would be nice to know what it would be like to move through the world without analyzing every experience and anything that fucking happens to me. That would be fantastic. It would feel like I guess maybe like a pressure relief in a way, but it's just so challenging to move away from that. Like I have to analyze everything. I'm constantly, like you said, Thomas, trying to connect. Like, where's this anxious feeling coming from? Oh yeah, this thing happened to me today, or this thing happened yesterday. Now it's creating these feelings that I can't always associate together. And then ultimately it leaves you a bit confused because you can recognize the somatic sensation in your body of like, I'm feeling anxious. Where is this coming from? Like, why is this feeling so intense right now? Oh yeah, this thing happened 6 hours ago that should create anxiety, but in the moment was not able to connect the dots.
And I think that there is quite a heavy tendency I think autistic people, maybe other neurodivergence as well, but I can only speak from the autistic perspective, that it is kind of hard to make those. Oh God, my brain's gone.
Oh, we get it.
What were you saying, Patrick?
Oh, just connecting those dots, and those associations where,
Yes,
yeah,
it's gone on me. Sorry.
that's okay. I think, this is actually nice to see while we're all sitting here, because the three of us mentioned we're all feeling a bit scattered today. And it's interesting, like, we're having a very real experience around this conversation. And I can see Megan being very deep in thought when I'm talking, and I'm paying attention to that out of my peripheral. But, I do think this is there's a paradox for me as a autistic ADHDer, where association with emotion and feeling and trying to name it and define it versus like constant sensory seeking and stimulation seeking, and like really trying to seek out that intensity as well. And then trying to like connect the dots with intensity seeking to soothe the anxiety in your body. It's really an interesting experience for me. And soccer has been so helpful. Thomas, I know you're really into fitness for that, probably a similar reason. And damn, I totally forgot playing soccer outside of it. It's frustrating. I know. I was talking to Megan about proprioceptive stim the other day, and needing to have my like soul and body crushed back into my body, and how often I feel the need for that. I asked my wife to do that the other day, and she looked at me and was like, "The fuck are you talking about?" And I was like, I just need you to do it. Like, I'll explain it to you later, but I need you to do that. And I think that's a very, very typical experience for me on almost a daily basis.
Yeah.
I think that there is a tendency sometimes. I remembered what I was going to say. I think that there is a tendency sometimes with autistic people that we need to know the reasons for things. And sometimes in a lot of cases, you don't always need to know. Like it could be useful in some cases to know why you're feeling a certain way. And sometimes it might just be, good to just chalk it up to possible stresses like mental health or sort of workplace things, being too productive, not getting enough rest, doing your special interests. And I think sometimes getting in my head about how I'm feeling stops me from like focusing on other things that I'm doing that are helping with my stress and my emotions. So unless I'm feeling sort of a deep aching issue, or that I'm, it's perhaps related to a relationship or a friendship, or if I'm having quite bad mental health crises or lows, then it's useful for me to kind of to go through and unpick that. So there's that. And I also think that creator autism from the inside. We were talking about Alexithymia on my podcast, and he was saying that there can be quite a large burden for using your like higher cognitive brain to do things that are quite simple or quick or emotional based, like social communication. So it really made me kind of think about, when I'm putting, like, how much effort am I putting into situations that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, that kind of mentality.
I really like how you're balancing kind of the autistic need to know, because I agree that's super regulating when I can pinpoint to like, oh, this is why I'm feeling that way. It just like calms, I say it calms my amygdala down. It just calms everything down. But balancing that with it, what'd you say?
Fix it at the core.
Yes.
Fix the reason and everything will be okay. It's like when you get really stressed about finishing a task on your computer and the programs aren't working. It's like, really need to get that done and then you'll be okay. Whereas sometimes,
I think it's soothing partly because it just reduces uncertainty. Like it's like, oh, okay, I can track why I'm feeling that way. But what I really like is how you balance it with acceptance. For me, in my training to become a psychologist, I probably did a bulk of my training in a mode of therapy called acceptance commitment therapy, or ACT, which is all about kind of accepting our emotions. It doesn't mean we have to like them, but accepting they exist, and then asking, okay, but how do I continue to move toward what matters to me, to move toward my values? And that was probably one of the best things for my anxiety, was learning an element of acceptance. It was, yes, sometimes I can locate, like, okay, my routine's off this, that's why I'm anxious today. Other times I can't. And it is about that. Okay, how am I going to hold this and live with this and continue to move toward what matters to me and not let it completely derail my day?
It's prioritization, I think,
Yeah.
but where you put your energy into.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you make a great point, Thomas, about that, because I do think a lot of autistic people are using a ton of cognitive energy to really figure out meaning behind everything. And that can just be, it's just unbelievably exhausted. And Megan, you and I have talked about like replenishing and trying to like recharging and being able to soothe. But sometimes it's really challenging to replenish that energy. And then you're playing catch up all the time.
Mhm.
And I think that's why so many of us are just going through the world feeling really, really exhausted all the time. And I like your example, Megan, with acceptance and commitment therapy. You and I have talked about like IFS as well, internal family systems, and that has been very helpful for me to have like parts work, because I can't always identify what's happening in the moment or what I'm experiencing or how I'm feeling. And if we're getting really cognitive, I really can't identify a thing. But if I can break it into parts, like a part of me is feeling overwhelmed, and it's okay for that to show up, and I'm going to accept that. And I don't need to find out the meaning of why. I just need to accept that it exists. And there are other parts of me that are feeling okay or feeling more grounded. And it's been pretty remarkably life-changing, if I'm being really honest about it. Like that work has been so tremendously supportive in the last 2 years.
I think it was really important to mention that the aspect to like the certainty around things, because I feel like it's kind of weird, because if you study neurotypicals like I have and just got this like so obsessed with understanding what's going on in their brains, I think there's a lot of situations where we give ourselves a hard time for not understanding certain things. Like neurotypicals tend to talk a lot about things like read the room and understand the hidden meaning and understand things just from the flow of the conversation. But from my experience, particularly in the workplace or within friend groups, a lot of people that you talk to individually after those big sort of group conversations, they have completely different ideas of what's gone on. And like, I feel like, we do have that drive to try and find that certainty out, specifically like around emotions and social things, which are inherently so uncertain and emotional. It can be kind of hard for us, and it's kind of one of those things that I think in a lot of neurotypicals, they go with what they feel from the situation, and then that's the truth. But compare and contrast each person in a certain group conversation, it's completely different. It's just that we like to know exactly what happened and exactly what people are wanting and exactly what they're trying to say.
There's a TV show called The Affair. I don't know if either of you have watched it, but I've found it so interesting because, and I think there's maybe a few shows that do this, but they like really lean into it. The first season, at least, where you see this exact same episode but from different people's perspectives. And so like the characters will be wearing different clothes in different people's memories. And it's just so interesting, that idea of subjectivity, of everyone's experience of the same conversation, and then how it encodes in memory is wildly different, which is frankly terrifying for me as someone who is anchored in like facts and logic of like, how did you get that from this conversation? But brains are weird. And the way we experience something is so heavily filtered by our past experiences, our beliefs, our biases. It's wild and terrifying.
Definitely agree.
Like all of us are going to walk away from this 40 minutes we spent together with different memories, different experiences.
And probably our own different, different perspectives and interpretations, right? Because I'm the type of person who will walk away and analyze, like, was that a good conversation? Did it feel meaningful? Was that like, did I show up the way I wanted to show up? All of those things will be running through my mind the rest of the day. So yeah, it's really interesting. Brains are weird.
It's just, I'll actually be having similar questions. I'll also be like, why was I so foggy during that conversation? What was happening? What was like, I'll also be thinking about like the relational dynamics, but also like, will that be it? Was that cohesive enough for a podcast? Was that a meaningful experience for Thomas? Was that worth his time to have him on? Yeah.
Yep.
I can confirm for an air of certainty that it's a meaningful experience. I love chatting to you, and it's really nice to chat to you, Patrick.
Thank you. Is this our awkward transition goodbye time? Because that's how I'm reading the internet right now.
I don't know how you guys wrap things up, so
we don't know either.
Do we want to say anything about where to find Thomas's work and then wrap up?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thomas, if you'd love to share with the audience where they can find what you're doing in the world and what you're putting out there.
Sure. You can find my podcast, the Thoughty Auti Podcast, on YouTube, Spotify, any of the podcasting streaming services, or you can check out my Instagram page at Thomas Henley UK, where I make daily posts and about 2 reels a day, autism related.
Your Instagram account is awesome. I mean, I found your stuff because Megan was on your podcast and shared some of that, and I was watching and really, really cool stuff. A lot of information, a lot of humor thrown in, which I really enjoy, and a lot of really cool perspectives. So really appreciate just being able to have this time together and spend the last 40 minutes talking about all of this.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I appreciate that.
To everyone who is listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast, new episodes are out every single Friday on all major podcast platforms. Like, download, subscribe, share, and goodbye.